That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
Imagine a television show so far ahead of its time that one of its own episodes became a casualty of the very fears it was trying to expose. Not pulled for poor ratings. Not shelved because it was badly written. Banned. Quietly, deliberately, and for over half a century. Buried so deep in the vault that most people didn't even know it existed. No reruns. No home video release. No streaming. Just silence. That is exactly what happened to one episode of The Twilight Zone. A show that was never supposed to play it safe. A show whose entire identity was built on making audiences squirm in their seats and question everything they thought they knew. And yet, even by its own standards, this one episode went too far. Or at least, that's what the network decided. For 55 years, they made that choice on behalf of everyone else. And for 55 years, the rest of us were never given the chance to decide for ourselves. Until now. Tonight, we are going to talk about that episode, what it was about, why it was banned, who it hurt, who it protected, and why its return after more than 5 decades is not just a footnote in television history. It is a statement. A reckoning. A reminder that the stories a society tries hardest to hide are almost always the ones it most desperately needs to hear. So dim the lights. Step carefully. Because we are about to enter a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of suppressed memory, national shame, and the long, complicated road back to the truth. To understand why this episode was banned, you first have to understand the world that made the Twilight Zone possible, and the world that ultimately tried to silence it. The show debuted on CBS on October 2, 1959. America at that moment was a country wearing two faces simultaneously. On the surface, everything looked like progress. The economy was booming, suburban neighborhoods were expanding, and television itself was becoming the centerpiece of the modern American living room. Families gathered around the set after dinner. Advertisers poured money into the medium. It felt, to many people, like the future had arrived and it was comfortable and well-lit and full of promise. But underneath all of that prosperity ran a current of genuine, bone-deep terror. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. The Korean War had barely cooled. Senator Joseph McCarthy had spent years convincing the American public that the enemy wasn't just abroad. It was your neighbor, your coworker, possibly your own family member. The Red Scare had poisoned the cultural atmosphere to the point where even asking certain questions could get you blacklisted. And the civil rights movement was beginning to tear open the great wound of American racial inequality in ways that polite society had spent generations trying to ignore. Rod Serling understood all of this. He had served in World War II as a paratrooper in the Pacific, and what he witnessed during that service, the violence, the dehumanization, the moral compromises of wartime, never left him. He came home not as a triumphant hero but as a man profoundly disturbed by what human beings were capable of doing to one another. And he wanted to write about it. The problem was that 1950s American television was not designed to handle that kind of honesty. Networks answered to sponsors. Sponsors answered to consumers. And consumers, in large part, did not want their evening entertainment to challenge them. They wanted reassurance. They wanted clean stories with clear heroes and predictable endings. The idea that American society might itself be diseased, that the real monsters weren't communists or aliens but ordinary people operating inside broken systems, was not considered acceptable primetime content. Serling had already learned this lesson the hard way. In 1955, he wrote a teleplay called Patterns, a brutal examination of corporate ruthlessness that was so well received it was performed live twice on NBC. Encouraged, he pushed further. In 1956, he wrote Noon on Doomsday, a drama directly inspired by the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago who was tortured and killed in Mississippi after being accused of whistling at a white woman. The two men responsible were acquitted by an all-white jury despite overwhelming evidence. It was one of the most visible and horrifying examples of American racial injustice of the 20th century, and Serling wanted to write about it directly. What happened next told him everything he needed to know about the limits of television at that time. Network executives, terrified of losing affiliate stations in the South and of offending sponsors, gutted the script. By the time it aired, the victim's race had been removed entirely, the Southern setting had been changed, and the entire point of the drama had been hollowed out. Serling was furious. He later said that the experience taught him that American television would never allow a writer to tackle race directly, and that if he wanted to say something true, he would have to disguise it. That disguise became the Twilight Zone. The genius of the format was its flexibility. Science fiction and fantasy gave Serling a kind of diplomatic immunity. A story about racism set on a distant planet somehow got past the censors in ways that a story about racism set in Alabama never would. A parable about mob mentality disguised as a story about alien invasion could explore the psychology of McCarthyism without any network executive being able to point to a specific political target. The speculative framing functioned as camouflage for social critique, and for 4 seasons, it largely worked. The show ran for 5 seasons and produced 156 episodes. Serling wrote or co-wrote 92 of them. He narrated every single one. His voice, calm, measured, slightly theatrical, became the sound of moral discomfort dressed up in storytelling. He wasn't just a television writer. He was a man using the most popular medium of his generation to ask questions that his society was actively trying to suppress. And then came the episode that even the Twilight Zone couldn't protect. The episode was called The Encounter. It aired on May 1, 1964, during the show's 5th and final season. And in the years that followed, it became one of the most talked-about episodes that almost nobody had actually seen. The premise is deceptively simple. 2 men. 1 room. 1 very old, very loaded sword. Neville Brand plays a World War II veteran named Fenton, a gruff, hard-drinking man who is sorting through the clutter in his attic when he is interrupted by a young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori, played by George Takei in one of his earliest television appearances. Arthur has knocked on Fenton's door looking for odd jobs and yard work. Fenton, in a moment of awkward generosity, invites him up for a beer. What starts as a mildly tense but seemingly ordinary exchange between 2 strangers slowly, methodically, and terrifyingly unravels into something much darker. The attic is filled with the debris of Fenton's past. Old furniture, photographs, military memorabilia. And there, among the relics, a Japanese samurai sword, a trophy looted from a dead soldier during the war. Fenton is proud of it in the vague, unreflective way that men are sometimes proud of things they probably should not be proud of. But Arthur cannot stop looking at it. And the more he looks at it, the more the atmosphere in the room begins to shift. As the 2 men drink and talk, layers begin to peel away from both of them. Fenton reveals that he killed many Japanese soldiers during the war, and the way he talks about it, without remorse, almost with satisfaction, reveals a man who has never genuinely reckoned with what he did. Arthur, meanwhile, begins behaving strangely. He speaks about the sword as though it has a spiritual presence, as though it remembers something. And then he drops the revelation that changes everything. His real name, he says, is Taro. And his father was a Japanese spy who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. The temperature in the room drops 20 degrees. From that moment forward, The Encounter becomes one of the most claustrophobic and psychologically intense pieces of television ever produced. Fenton's already thin veneer of goodwill cracks and falls away entirely, replaced by a paranoid, racially charged suspicion. He becomes convinced that Arthur's presence in his home is not coincidental, that the past has sent this young man to settle some old account. Arthur, in turn, grows increasingly agitated, increasingly volatile, as though the guilt he has inherited from his father, a guilt he had nothing to do with, is crushing him from the inside. The sword hangs between them like a question neither man wants to answer. And here is where Serling did something truly remarkable and deeply uncomfortable. He refused to make either man innocent. Fenton is not a hero. He is a damaged, possibly violent man who committed acts during the war that haunt him precisely because he knows they were wrong, even if he cannot bring himself to say so. He killed an unarmed man. He took the sword as a trophy. His treatment of Arthur is ugly and racially loaded from the very beginning. He is not the protagonist of this story in any traditional sense. But Arthur is not simply a victim, either. His confession about his father is ambiguous in ways that the episode deliberately refuses to resolve. Is he telling the truth? Is it a story he was told as a child and has come to believe? Is he weaponizing a dark family history against himself as a form of self-destruction, acting out the guilt that Japanese Americans were effectively forced to carry simply by existing in wartime America? The episode never tells you. It makes you sit with the uncertainty. The ending is violent and bleak. Both men are consumed by the forces they were never equipped to handle. The sword, the war, the history, the shame. There is no redemption arc. There is no lesson announced from on high. There is only consequence. Serling had always been willing to leave his audiences uncomfortable. But this time, he left them with no exit at all. The reaction to the encounter was swift and severe. CBS was flooded with complaints almost immediately after the episode aired. Some viewers called it offensive. Some called it anti-American. Asian American advocacy groups objected specifically to the suggestion that Arthur's father had been complicit in the Pearl Harbor attack, a narrative they argued reinforced the exact kind of racial suspicion that had been used to justify one of the most shameful episodes in American domestic history. That history is worth pausing on, because it is absolutely central to understanding why the encounter was so explosive. In the weeks following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States government made a decision that it would spend decades trying to rationalize and ultimately had to formally apologize for. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens, many of them born in the United States and with no connection whatsoever to Japan beyond their heritage, were forcibly removed from their homes, businesses, and communities and relocated to internment camps in remote, barren regions of the American interior. They were not charged with any crime. They were not given trials. They were not presented with evidence of wrongdoing, because there was none. They were imprisoned because of their ethnicity, because the government and large segments of the American public could not or would not distinguish between Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans, and because wartime fear had collapsed that distinction entirely. Farms were lost. Businesses were destroyed. Communities that had taken generations to build were dismantled in a matter of weeks. And when the war ended and the camps were finally closed, the survivors were sent home, to homes many of them no longer had, with a small amount of cash and no acknowledgement of what had been done to them. George Takei, who played Arthur in the encounter, was not performing from research. He was performing from memory. He was 4 years old when the soldiers arrived at his family's home in Los Angeles. He remembered his mother crying. He remembered his father trying to explain something that could not be explained to a child. He remembered the dust, the heat, and the barbed wire of the Roware Relocation Center in Arkansas where his family was held for years. He remembered being a prisoner of his own country before he was old enough to understand what a country was. When the episode suggested that Arthur's father had been a spy, that suggestion landed in a very specific and very raw historical context. The entire justification for the internment had been the claim, made without evidence and later thoroughly disproven, that Japanese Americans posed a security risk, that they were loyal to Japan rather than America, that they could not be trusted. Decades after the war, in 1964, with the internment still raw and unaddressed, airing an episode that seemed to validate that claim even fictionally, even ambiguously, struck many people as deeply irresponsible. And so CBS did what institutions typically do when something makes them uncomfortable. They made it disappear. The encounter was pulled from syndication. When The Twilight Zone began its long afterlife in rerun packages, on cable marathons, and eventually on home video and streaming platforms, this episode was not included. It became a ghost, referenced in fan discussions, circulated in grainy bootleg copies among dedicated collectors, but officially non-existent. For decades, the official record of The Twilight Zone had a quiet gap where this episode should have been, and most people never even noticed.